So today we thought we would tell you a little bit about the research that we conducted here in BC that might tell you a little bit about how families, from families' perspective, how they feel things are going with the current funding model. So this work is based on Dr. Gardner's dissertation work, and we're working on getting this work published. But she's been very busy. She just had a baby, so cut her some slack. I'll just start off by giving a short introduction, but then Dr. Gardner will give you all of the research findings, and then I'll wrap up and talk a little bit about where we hope to go in the future. Okay, so just a little bit of background in terms of what motivated this research. Family quality of life, of course, is a construct that's really important to define, but also important to think about in children with autism in particular, because they might have a kind of a unique experience. At least parents who are raising a child with autism might have a particular experience that might be unique amongst other developmental disabilities. So when we first looked at the literature, we wanted to know, first of all, what was out there in terms of research on family quality of life. And what's motivating this research primarily is that we know that people with developmental disabilities are now living longer. It used to be that, even children, for example, with diagnosed at birth with Down syndrome, initially we knew that these children required a lot of medical care. There were, heart issues and other kind of significant medical issues that threatened their lives even. But now we've solved a lot of those medical problems in many children with different types of developmental disabilities. So, medical issues are not threatening their lives anymore. The problem is now, how do we support them to have a good quality of life? And so that's one of the motivators of this research, is that these children, we no longer have to worry about necessarily their health condition, but more about mental health, more about quality of life. The other thing that we know is that often mothers are the primary carers. That doesn't mean that there isn't a father around, but that the mothers somehow take responsibility for children with developmental disabilities. And it usually is quite intense in terms of what we've seen, some of the families we've worked with directly, who say that they often have to quit their jobs when they find out that their child has a developmental disability. And what happens is that if the mother takes on the primary responsibility, and it's quite intense and it takes up a lot of her time, and she has to quit a job or not continue a career that she hoped or aspired to have, it creates an imbalance in the family system. And this could impact the family as a whole, because we know that families work more as a unit rather than, individual members. And so anything that happens to one individual will have ripple effects in the system. We also know that 25%, at least 25% of family caregivers are now over the age of 60. So, there was a movement quite a while back of deinstitutionalization, which was very positive for society, in that we didn't put children with developmental disabilities away in an institution and forgot about them, or even worse, were abused in these institutions. Now what happens is that a lot of the services are in the communities, but most of these children are now living at home, which is good in one sense, but on the other side of it, all the burden is on the family to take, or most of the burden is on the family to take care of these children into adulthood. So despite these facts, we realize that the literature on family quality of life really didn't exist. There was more to do with children and how to, remediate the problem in the children or how to support the children and their disability. But there isn't a lot on how to support families who are supporting a child with a disability. And so we thought it's really important that researchers, practitioners, and policymakers understand what families need in order to be supported themselves so that they can better support a child with developmental disability. So some of the things we thought, first we need to know out there in the literature what exists for just generally this group of children called children with developmental disabilities. And that could include a variety of children, children with intellectual disability, children with certain genetic syndromes. And because the experience of having a child with any kind of developmental disability will be quite similar, at least some things will be similar across conditions. So things like the developmental disability is often unexpected. There aren't many parents who will tell you, oh, I knew I was going to have a child with Down syndrome, or I knew I was going to have a child with autism. It's usually unexpected and therefore kind of takes a while to get adjusted to receiving that information. The other thing is that when you have a child that's a little different in whatever way, that doesn't quite fit the norm, there really are no parenting models out there to help guide you, right? So we often, or it used to be more, not so much in our society where people move around a lot, but it used to be that you could rely on grandparents or you could rely on extended family to kind of support new mothers, new fathers. Don't worry so much about that. I've been through that. I know what that's like. Now, first of all, we have less of that, but secondly, when you have a child with a developmental disability, extended family members really don't know much in order to provide that kind of support, right? So the family is already a little bit disadvantaged in that sense, that they need more specialized help. The child is also more dependent on family and for longer periods of time, right? So where most of us kind of go, phew, my kid is finally out of the, a period where they rely totally on me. They're now more independent. For a parent of a child with a developmental disability, that dependency could go on into adulthood. And so that puts maybe more additional strain on the family. And we know that the family is a system, and anything or any member in the family who's negatively impacted in some way will affect the whole family system. And that's true whether you have autism or you have another condition. The other thing that's common is that families rely on government and professional services. And this is true of whether you have a child with ADHD or whether you have a child with autism. You still have to, at some point, access specialized services. But what's unique to children with autism spectrum disorder? Well, we think that, when you have a child with ASD in the family, that there are certain unique characteristics that you're facing as a parent, as a family. And one thing is that part of the disability is that it's difficult to sometimes communicate and relate to other people. And so that can affect the family system right there differently than, let's say, a child who might have a different sort of disability that doesn't so much involve social relationships. The other thing is the genetic sort of risk in autism. We know that it does run in families. You might end up seeing more families that have one child with ASD, also have 2 or 3 children with ASD. And so it affects more than one family member, but it also affects maybe some other family members in different ways. They might not have ASD, but they might have other sort of learning disabilities or other issues. The severity of the symptoms don't necessarily reflect the need. And this is, I think, more true of ASD than it is of some other conditions. So you can't get a good handle on just how much support certain kids or certain families need just based on one assessment. So if you look just at their IQ, for example, if you look and say, oh, this child is not intellectually handicapped, in fact, they have superior intelligence, that doesn't tell you that they're doing well, right? For children with ASD, sometimes highly gifted children can actually be quite severely affected in terms of their social understanding or social relationships. The other thing that we know in ASD is we know a lot about the types of services that these children need and their families need, the different professionals that they need to access, and all of those things I think we have a pretty good handle on, but we don't know how to best tailor those services to each of the family's needs, because the families, just like the children, are so different, right? So we know that it's such a spectrum, and the families as well are so unique and so different, each in terms of how they adapt and cope with the autism in their child. So we know because of this difference that families will react very differently to the situation of autism. And for some, and this is we found in the literature, subjective experiences from family members, whereas on the one hand, you have some families who say, and this is a quote from a particular study, that the individuals who were interviewed, one family said, autism has made us realize how precious and great to make each day. We love life. Whereas another parent said almost complete opposite. We realized the truth, and by the end of the day we were distraught because we knew the truth about it. It was actually the worst day of our lives. That was the day we came to terms with the fact that we had this problem. So you can think to yourself, wow, on the one hand, one family sees it as a gift, whereas another family sees it almost as a kind of doomsday sort of scenario. And you could say, well, there are different subjective experiences depending on the families, but it could also be the timing, right? Depending on when you've received the diagnosis, maybe when you first received the diagnosis, it might seem like it's just horrible and overwhelming. Whereas the first family, the family that says we've really learned how to appreciate autism, might be saying this from the vantage point of having gone through a very difficult experience and then seeing that they could overcome and could face this difficult condition and come through it on the other side. So I think we have to take these perspectives into account and think about how different families will see things differently, but also at what point in the family's trajectory are we asking them about their experience.